Content warning. This narrative contains vivid descriptions of historical violence and public executions. Viewer discretion is advised. Recommended age gate, 18+. If you value unvarnished history, consider liking and subscribing after the opening. Rome. Dusk on the Tiber. A man huddles on a narrow stone bridge while a crowd mutters behind him. He has been accused of parricide, not only the crime of killing a parent, but the annihilation of a household's sacred center. Men in leather draw a coarse sack over his shoulders, its seams closing against the sky. Someone tosses a rooster inside. A dog whimpers. A viper, chilled by the river wind, coils and hisses. The sack is stitched shut, weighted, and flung into the black current. Water takes the sound of his last screams, and the river bears him away, already erasing the shape of a man who moments before had a name. Cicero and later jurists recorded the law that prescribed this fate, poena cullei, the punishment of the sack. But the detail that lingers is not the statute, but the spectacle. A private horror performed at the city's edge, meant to mark a transgression so unnatural that it required an unnatural death and a symbolic denial of the burial rites that bind Romans to memory. That image, sown, silenced, submerged, is a perfect entry point to the thesis of this program. Ancient Rome did not merely execute wrongdoers. Over many centuries, the Republic and then the Empire developed a catalogue of punishments intentionally theatrical, brutally inventive, and designed to do more than kill. These measures humiliated the body, erased the name, invoked animal and elemental forces, and turned suffering into a public language of deterrence. Across this episode, I will take you through 12 punishments so brutal they receded from polite record and public memory, each one a tool in the Roman toolbox of power. We will look at how law, rumor, and spectacle fused to manufacture obedience, and how that fusion sometimes left traces so strange that historians still debate them. If you want history without filters, hit like and subscribe. Before we descend into each vignette, a brief map. The 12 punishments we will examine are poena cullei, the punishment of the sack; the Tarpeian rock, throwing traitors from Rupes Tarpeia; crucifixion as state spectacle; decimation in the army, decimatio; fustuarium, execution by cudgel for military shame; damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to beasts in the arena; burning as spectacle and human torches; pulveratio, or death by crushing, sometimes associated with elephants, indefinido; damnatio memoriae, official erasure; scaphism, or slow insect consumption, a Persian origin method described in Greek sources and rarely linked to Roman practice, indefinido; slow roasting, or death by controlled fire, mors per ignem; and the ritual live burial of Vestal virgins accused of breaking their vow. Each of these carried a legal rationale, ritual choreography, and a propagandistic function. Each also reveals lines of class, gender, and political control. Poena cullei, the punishment of the sack. Imagine the legal language on a scroll. A man condemned for parricide would be denied burial and subjected to this mulct of humiliation. Cicero mentions the custom, and later jurists like Ulpian and Paulus supply legal detail. The offender would be sewn into a leather sack with assorted animals. Historically, a dog, a rooster, a viper are repeated in sources, then thrown into water. The mechanics are straightforward and grotesquely symbolic. The sack denies the body its proper rights. The animals imply unnatural company. The river, a liminal place, takes the corpse away from funeral rites and ancestral altars. The social target was extreme. Parricide violated the bedrock of Roman family piety, pietas, and community continuity. As a public act at the river's edge, the punishment signaled the impossibility of reintegration, not merely removal from the polis, but annihilation of any claim to familial identity. Modern scholars debate the exact composition of animals and whether the practice was continuous or sporadic. The legal skeleton is clear, but certain procedural details remain the subject of philological correction. In any case, poena cullei is less a penal technicality than a ritualized expulsion from the social world. Rupes Tarpeia, the Tarpeian rock, is both a place and a symbol. Overlooking the Roman Forum, the cliff once served as the literal drop for those judged traitors to the city. The image is cinematic. A condemned man shunted to the cliff's edge, the Forum's marble glinting below, magistrates and senators present as witness. Livy and other analysts connect the rock's use to ancient stories of betrayal. The legendary Tarpeia herself, whose name became a shorthand for treachery. The Tarpeian execution was reserved for citizens guilty of high treason, for whom death alone was considered insufficient. The public fall conferred a particular shame. The cliff made the act visible to the civic center, turning the heart of Roman politics into an execution theater. Later, during the Republic and early Empire, the practice ebbed and flowed. At times, the rock functioned as a formal sanction, at others, as a rhetorical threat. The symbolic logic is simple. To be cast from the civic height is to be cast out of the community's memory and authority. Crucifixion, though most commonly associated today with the death of a single religious figure, was in Roman practice a broad instrument of deterrence. It was a cruel hybrid of torment and theatrical display, primarily reserved for slaves, brigands, and those the state wanted to mark as wholly outside civic protection. The most brutal instance recorded in Roman sources came after the Third Servile War led by Spartacus. Appian reports that thousands of captured insurgents were crucified along the Appian Way between Rome and Capua. A spectacle of rows of bodies meant to declare the futility of rebellion. Crucifixion combined prolonged suffering with total public visibility. Victims were often left to die slowly, stripped of identity, nailed or tied to wood, sometimes accompanied by placards of shame. Tacitus and Seneca comment on the moral shock these spectacles were meant to provoke. For the state, crucifixion was a pedagogical cruelty, a macabre billboard stretching along major roads. It is worth noting that crucifixion's use was not uniform across time and region. As with other punishments, legal prescriptions and on-the-ground practice could diverge. Decimation, decimatio, reveals how the Romans turned discipline into group terror. In theory, a legion guilty of mutiny, flight, or collective cowardice could be divided into groups of 10. Lots would decide which man in each group would be executed by his comrades. Livy and later military writers describe the practice and its lingering role in the Roman imagination as the ultimate collective deterrent. The psychological logic is brutal. By forcing soldiers to kill their comrades, the command authority rewired unit cohesion into mutual surveillance and crushing shame, ensuring compliance out of fear of communal retribution. Ancient sources suggest that decimation was rare because of its destructive impact on manpower and morale, yet when invoked, it sent a stark message about the penalty of collective failure. Vegetius and other later writers discuss the practice as a historical memory. As with many Roman punishments, practice and prescription do not always align neatly, but decimation's symbolic force is unmistakable. Fustuarium, execution by cudgel or club, was a punishment reserved for certain military crimes. Desertion, dereliction under arms, sleeping on watch. The mechanics were primitive and communal. Soldiers would beat the offender to death with clubs, stones, or other available instruments. Sometimes the condemned would be stripped of their armor, forced to the center of the camp and beaten by comrades. Polybius and later historians narrate that the ritualized brutality served 3 purposes. It eliminated a dangerous example, it reaffirmed group discipline through participation, and it associated shame with the most basic physical vulnerability. Unlike decimation, fustuarium typically targeted individuals rather than entire units. yet it retained the same theatrical logic: punishment as a collective reaffirmation of order. Damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to beasts, is where the Roman appetite for theater and cruelty intersected with entertainment. In the arena, the state's capacity to kill became a public performance. Criminals, deserters, enemies of the state, and even political prisoners could be dispatched into the amphitheater to be mauled by lions, bears, or trained beasts. Seneca, in his moral letters, and Tacitus, when describing spectacles, both register a complex reaction: fascination mixed with moral horror. The arena's choreography was precise. Animals trained to tear, men garbed for spectacle, and crowds whose cheers were a political instrument. Damnatio ad bestias served as both chattel punishment and a ritualized affirmation of domination. Humans placed beneath the sovereign spectacle of Roman control. It is critical to understand that such condemnations were not always death sentences by chance. They were legal sentences designed to perform a message about state power in the most visceral terms. Burning alive, or the use of human beings as torches in imperial gardens, is a stain that appears in several ancient narratives. Tacitus reports that Nero, after the Great Fire of Rome in AD 64, assigned Christians to be executed and used as illumination for his gardens. He describes parodies of funeral rites and grotesque spectacle. Seneca decried the morally corrosive effect of such entertainments. These accounts are presented in moral and political register by Roman historians who often wrote with rhetorical aims, and modern historians treat such descriptions with careful skepticism about scale and motive. Still, the idea is the same: fire as a medium of humiliation and centralization, converting private suffering into a curated imperial display. Other imperial contexts record burning as formal punishment for arsonists or traitors, and the imagery of humans turned into lamps or torches made an indelible point about who belonged to civic life and who could be used up for the ruler's amusement. Pulveratio, execution by crushing, enters the catalogue at a point where politics, spectacle, and importation of foreign practices meet. Crushing under heavy weights or by beasts could be a method of execution. There are scattered reports in ancient sources of elephants used to crush enemies in earlier Hellenistic courts. In Roman practice, the use of elephants for execution is less well attested. Some later accounts and compilations allude to the spectacular use of crushing, sometimes involving heavy rollers or beasts. Because direct Roman legal prescriptions for elephant-based executions are sparse, any specific attribution should be treated cautiously. For now, pulveratio as an idea captures the use of overwhelming force, the deliberate annihilation of the human form by mechanisms of mass pressure, and in certain episodes the Romans borrowed or admired theatrical elements from Eastern monarchies. Where the evidence is uncertain, I will flag those passages as indefinito and call for verification. But the interpretive point stands: crushing, whether by machinery or beasts, enacted an annihilating symbolism that fit elite aims to display unassailable power. Damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory, is subtler, but perhaps the most intellectually cruel of the punishments. To have one's name chiseled from an inscription, one's portrait defaced, and one's official record purged, is a kind of posthumous execution. The Senate exercised this sanction for disgraced emperors or traitors. Examples include the erasures associated with Sejanus, and after his assassination, the attempts to obliterate Domitian's image from public monuments. Archaeological traces make damnatio memoriae legible precisely because of absence. Holes in stonework where a name once stood, faces hacked from a statue's marble. This punishment operates on a different temporal register. Its power lies in official forgetting. It warns that not all violence is physical. The state can intend a social death that endures. Damnatio memoriae often functioned alongside other punishments, but its objective was ideological: to rewrite the civic past and assert who deserved to be remembered. Scaphism, known more commonly from Greek accounts as an exotic Persian cruelty, involved enclosing a victim between boat-like structures, exposing them to insects and the elements until idiopathic death. Plutarch and other Greek writers describe cases of scaphism in the Persian context. Whether Romans adopted or adapted this method is a matter of debate. Some medieval and later sources attribute similar practices to Romans in lurid retellings, but surviving Roman legal and literary records rarely prescribe scaphism as a routine penalty. I mark its Roman application as indefinido, where sources are scant. Why include scaphism in this catalogue? Because the Roman imagination, receptive to foreign exemplar, could absorb and amplify tales of foreign tortures for rhetorical ends. Whether or not scaphism was practiced by Romans, accounts of it circulated in the ancient world and could be deployed to shame enemies or to construct the image of the barbaric other. Occasionally, rumour and political theatre blurred boundaries between what was native and what was borrowed. Slow roasting and deaths by controlled fire, mors per ignem, appear in a few Roman anecdotes and in the Christian martyr accounts that later transmit details into our records. Burning was a tool for punishing arson, sacrilege, or especially abject crimes. It also became a performative means of enacting purification by fire. Gridirons, iron chairs heated until flesh succumbed, or public burnings all belong to this category. Again, often our evidence comes filtered through moralizing accounts, Christians' martyrologies, Tacitus's reports of Nero's persecutions, and later ecclesiastical writers who preserved scenes of martyrdom. The state's calculus could be both legal and symbolic. Fire both destroys and transforms. The chilling artistry of these punishments is their double message. The body is consumed, and the community witnesses an elemental erasure. The live burial of Vestal virgins touches a confluence of gender, religious law, and the politics of purity. Vestal virgins were sacrosanct priestesses sworn to chastity for the duration of their service. Breaking that vow was a capital offense because it threatened the pax deorum, the state's relationship with the gods. The punishment, as described in Roman annals and exemplified by several notable trials, was ritual live burial. The convicted Vestal would be placed in an underground chamber with a small supply of food and water and left to die. The ritual made the crime an offense not merely against a family, but against Rome's religious fabric. The procedure was a macabre inversion. The priestess, once mediator between gods and people, became the instrument of a punitive rite meant to symbolically close the relationship she violated. Writers like Livy and Plutarch discuss the cases with mixture of horror and fascination. It is one of the few rituals where gender, religious office, and civic survival coalesce into a punishment that is both juridical and sacramental. Across these 12 punishments, a pattern emerges. They were often classed, some designated for slaves, others for citizens, some for soldiers, and that stratification mattered. Rome's legal culture insisted that the citizen body be shielded from certain shames while exposing others to exemplary horrors. Public spaces, the Forum, the Appian Way, the Amphitheatre, the Tarpeian Rock, functioned as stages where political meanings were hammered into the populace's memory. The state did not merely punish for retribution, it punished to teach. Executions addressed crowds as much as they addressed culprits, and when the state sought to erase names, it did so to rewrite civic identity. There is also a paradox at work. Damnatio memoriae, the official erasure of an individual's presence, paradoxically makes historians attentive. The absence becomes material. Chiseled stones, empty pedestals, and scratched-out inscriptions call our attention precisely because they suggest a violent erasure. Likewise, tales of exotic tortures imported from Persia or elsewhere can tell us more about Roman anxieties than about factual practice. When Roman writers amplify foreign cruelties, they are often making political commentary, to shame an opponent as uncivilized, or to dramatize the state's reach. Primary voices in our sources complicate rather than clarify. Cicero's forensic language treats some punishments as legal facts. Seneca's moral essays condemn the appetite for spectacle. Tacitus records rumors and imperial excesses with a cynical historian's eye. Appian and Plutarch furnish detailed but sometimes rhetorical descriptions. Archaeology fills gaps, mass graves, defaced monuments, and inscriptions that bear erasure are tangible traces of this punitive world. Yet every source comes with bias and genre imperatives. Annalists loved a memorable punishment. Orators used horror as rhetorical leverage. That is why, when I discuss pulveratio by elephants or scaphism's presence in Roman practice, I flag uncertainty and urge verification of specialized claims. Some punishments are well attested in Roman law and ritual. Others survive on the slimmest textual traces and substantial interpretive work. Why did Rome invest so much in punitive theater? The answer lies in the relationship between spectacle and sovereignty. Public punishment amplified the reach of state power to the senses. To see, hear, and smell punishment established an effective regime of obedience. When the populace watched a line of crucified bodies, when the forum watched a traitor hurled from a cliff, or when a statue's face was ground away, the message was not simply, "This man is punished." The message was, the state decides who is visible, who is edible to beasts, who is remembered. In short, punishment became grammar for political existence. Yet there were limits and consequences. Spectacles that normalized cruelty could corrode civic compassion and legitimation. Seneca warns that appetite for blood can spread like an infection. Moralists worried that the state's use of violence might turn citizens into voyeurs. Historical episodes show that instruments of terror could be turned inward. Emperors using spectacles to intimidate opponents, factions weaponizing public memory, and ultimately such patterns could contribute to instability. The law's ability to demand and regulate violence meant that visible brutality could be both instrument and hazard. As the sun sets on our catalogue, picture the Colosseum at dusk, empty shadows where once crowds roared. Its architecture, admired by tourists and scholars alike, also bears witness to a political grammar that used human bodies to teach obedience. Rome's monuments are not neutral stones, they are palimpsests of power sewn into marble and bronze. The dozen punishments we have surveyed are part of that palimpsest. Sewn sacks, cliff's edges, rows of crosses, the stick's blow, beasts in the arena, the consuming flame, crushing force, chiseled names, insects, slow work, and the sealed chamber beneath the sacred soil. Each is an instrument of control, each a rhetorical act. If there is a moral to take from these histories, it is not a simple condemnation dressed in modern virtue. It is a caution about the way authority can ritualize cruelty and make terror into pedagogy. Institutions that depend on spectacle to sustain themselves risk teaching the very behaviors that corrode their legitimacy. When violence becomes entertainment, the social contract is strained. When names are erased, the community loses an anchor of memory. If this journey through Rome's darker ledger has unsettled you, leave a comment. Which punishment struck you as the most chilling? If you believe history should be told without sanitizing the past, subscribe to Crown and Dagger for the next comparative episode. We will soon trace similar punitive theatres in another empire and see how different polities fashioned terror into authority. Thank you for watching.